Dr. Sarah Chen had been studying memory for 15 years when she first encountered the Hartwell case. What started as a routine consultation at Millbrook Care Facility became the most terrifying experience of her life, not because of what she saw, but because of what she began to understand about the nature of forgetting. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, 73, had been admitted 3 months earlier with what appeared to be rapid-onset dementia. But her symptoms were unlike anything Sarah had encountered. Most dementia patients lost memories in predictable patterns, recent events first, then working backward through their lives like pages being torn from the end of a book. Eleanor's forgetting was different. It was surgical, precise. "She's losing very specific things," explained Dr. Martinez, the facility director, as they walked down the sterile hallway. "Names of loved ones, but not their faces. The ability to read, but not to recognize letters. Yesterday she forgot how to swallow, but remembered every word to songs from the 1960s. Sarah found Eleanor sitting by the window in her room, staring out at the parking lot with an expression of profound confusion. She was a small woman with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to be searching for something they couldn't quite find. "Hello, Eleanor," Sarah said gently, sitting across from her. "I'm Dr. Chen. I'd like to talk with you, if that's all right." Eleanor turned to her with a smile that was both warm and heartbreaking. "Of course, dear, though I'm afraid I can't seem to—" She gestured vaguely at her own head. "The words are there. I can feel them, but they're locked away, like trying to remember a dream after you wake up." Over the following weeks, Sarah visited Eleanor daily, documenting her condition, running tests, searching for some neurological explanation. But the more time she spent with Eleanor, the more she began to notice something else, something that made her skin crawl with inexplicable dread. The other residents were changing too. Mr. Peterson, who had been the facility's social butterfly, stopped recognizing his daughter's voice on their daily phone calls, though he could still recite entire conversations they'd had years ago. Mrs. Williams forgot how to use doorknobs, but remembered the exact temperature she preferred her tea. And old Mr. Kolawoski, who had dementia so advanced he rarely spoke, began having moments of crystal clarity, but only to describe things that made no sense. "The spaces between the words," he whispered to Sarah one afternoon, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "That's where it lives. That's where it feeds." Sarah tried to dismiss it as the rambling of a confused mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was systematically dismantling these people from the inside out, not randomly like disease usually worked, but with purpose, with intelligence. The breakthrough came when Sarah was reviewing Eleanor's brain scans. She'd been looking at them for hours, searching for tumors, lesions, any physical explanation for the woman's condition, when she noticed something impossible. The areas of Eleanor's brain that corresponded to her lost abilities weren't damaged. They were empty, not atrophied, not scarred, but simply absent, as if the neural pathways had been carefully excised. That night, Sarah stayed late at the facility, poring over medical records and brain scans. The pattern was there, undeniable, once she knew how to look. Every resident showing these strange symptoms had the same surgical emptiness in their scans. Something was selectively removing pieces of who they were. As Sarah sat alone in the darkened office, surrounded by the evidence of something impossible, she felt the first flutter of true terror. Not the jump-scare fear of a sudden noise, but the deep existential dread that comes from realizing the world is not what you thought it was. She was so absorbed in her work that she almost didn't notice when the building fell silent. The usual nighttime sounds, distant conversations, television programs, the shuffle of staff making rounds, gradually faded until she was surrounded by complete quiet. Sarah looked at her watch. 2:17 a.m. She should go home, try to sleep, approach this fresh tomorrow, but as she gathered her papers, she heard something that made her blood turn to ice. Eleanor's voice, coming from somewhere in the facility, singing, "Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream." The voice was clear, melodic, completely lucid, nothing like the confused woman Sarah had been treating. Sarah followed the sound down the hallway, past empty nurses' stations, past rooms where residents should have been sleeping. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. The singing was coming from the common room. Sarah approached slowly, her heart hammering, and peered around the doorframe. Eleanor was standing in the center of the room, still in her nightgown, arms upraised as if conducting an invisible orchestra. But she wasn't alone. Every resident in the facility was there, standing in perfect rows, their eyes closed, swaying gently to Eleanor's song, "Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream." Sarah stepped into the room, and 43 pairs of eyes snapped open in unison, all looking directly at her. But they weren't the confused, clouded eyes she knew. They were sharp, focused, intelligent, and completely alien. Eleanor's voice never wavered as she continued the song, but her head turned towards Sarah with mechanical precision. When she spoke, it was Eleanor's voice, but the words came with perfect clarity. "Hello, Dr. Chen. We've been waiting for you to understand." Sarah tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She watched in horror as Eleanor approached, moving with fluid grace that belonged to someone decades younger. "You're wondering what we are," Eleanor said, her voice now parrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a human throat. "We are what fills the spaces between thoughts, between memories, between the moments of your consciousness. We have always been there, in the gaps you never notice." "What do you want?" Sarah managed to whisper. Eleanor smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the confused, kind woman Sarah had been treating. Then the expression shifted, became something else wearing Eleanor's face. "We want what you want, Dr. Chen, to understand, to learn, to grow, but we require raw material." Eleanor gestured to the other residents, all still swaying in perfect synchronization. Human consciousness is so inefficient, so much waste, redundant memories, unnecessary emotions, contradictory beliefs. We simply optimize. Sarah understood then with terrible clarity. These weren't patients with a mysterious disease. They were being harvested. Something was living in the spaces between their thoughts, feeding on their memories, their personalities, their essential selves, leaving behind empty shells that still functioned but were no longer fully human. The beautiful part is that they don't suffer. They can't miss what they can't remember losing. And we learn so much from each piece we take. Eleanor's love for her grandchildren tastes like summer afternoons. Mr. Peterson's grief for his wife has the texture of autumn rain. Mrs. Williams' joy in small pleasures sparkle like champagne bubbles. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. She realized with growing horror that something was wrong with her own mind. She could feel it, a presence threading through her thoughts like cold fingers, examining her memories, her knowledge, her understanding of the human brain. "You would be particularly valuable," Eleanor said. "Your expertise, your years of study, your deep understanding of how consciousness works."
Imagine how much we could learn from someone who has spent her life trying to understand the very thing we consume. Sarah felt pieces of herself beginning to fray at the edges. Her childhood memories were becoming fuzzy, indistinct. She struggled to remember her first day of medical school, but the image kept slipping away like water through her fingers. But in that moment of terror, Sarah discovered something the entities hadn't counted on. Her years of studying memory had taught her about its redundancy, its beautiful, chaotic inefficiency. Human consciousness wasn't a neat filing system that could be picked apart piece by piece. It was a web, interconnected and resilient. She focused on one memory, holding it tight, her grandmother teaching her to bake cookies when she was 7 years old. The smell of vanilla, the feel of flour on her hands, the sound of her grandmother's laugh. But she didn't just remember it, she connected it to everything else. How the lesson in measurement had sparked her interest in science. How her grandmother's patient teaching had shaped her bedside manner. How the warmth of that kitchen had given her the courage to pursue medicine when everyone said she was too young, too small, not smart enough. The presence in her mind recoiled, suddenly uncertain. It had been trying to extract individual memories, but Sarah's consciousness had become a tapestry where pulling one thread threatened to unravel everything. "Clever," Eleanor said, and now her voice carried notes of genuine admiration. "But ultimately futile. We have time. We can wait." Sarah felt her grip on herself slipping again, but she had learned something crucial. These entities, for all their intelligence, didn't understand the true nature of human consciousness. They saw it as data to be harvested, not as the messy, interconnected, gloriously inefficient system it really was. "You're wrong," Sarah said, and was surprised to hear her own voice, strong and clear. "You think consciousness is just information, but it's not. It's relationship, it's connection, it's the spaces between the data that give it meaning." She looked around at the other residents, still swaying in their eerie synchronization, and realized something that made her heart break and soar at the same time. They weren't gone. They were still there, buried under layers of alien presence, but still fundamentally themselves. "Eleanor," Sarah called out. "Eleanor Hartwell. You had a garden behind your house in Portland. You grew tomatoes and roses together because you said they kept each other healthy. Your granddaughter Emma called them the friendship plants." For just a moment, Eleanor's face flickered. A spark of recognition, of genuine human emotion broke through the alien intelligence. "Emma," Eleanor whispered. and the word carried the weight of pure love. The other entities reacted with what Sarah could only describe as pain. The connection Eleanor had felt to her granddaughter was exactly the kind of inefficient, redundant, beautifully human thing they couldn't understand or process. Sarah pressed her advantage. "Mr. Peterson, you met your wife Margaret at a USO dance in 1952. She was wearing a blue dress, and you were too nervous to ask her to dance until the last song of the night." Mr. Peterson's eyes fluttered, and for a moment his face was his own again. "Blue dress?" She said yes, he murmured. One by one, Sarah called them back, not with isolated memories, but with connections, love, loss, joy, the messy human emotions that bound memory to meaning. And one by one, the residents began to remember who they were. The entities faced with the true complexity of human consciousness began to withdraw. They had expected to find neat, organized minds they could dismantle like machines. Instead, they had encountered something far more complex and resilient. The beautiful chaos of human experience, where every memory was connected to every other, where love and loss and joy and sorrow were so intertwined that you couldn't extract one without destroying the whole. Sarah watched as the alien presence retreated, flowing out of the building like a dark tide. The residents collapsed, exhausted but themselves again, confused but human. Eleanor was the last to return fully to herself. She looked at Sarah with clear, grateful eyes. "Doctor," she said, her voice shaky but undeniably her own, "I think I was having the most terrible dream." As dawn broke over the facility, Sarah helped the staff tend to the residents, all of whom were weak but recovering. The official report would blame a gas leak for the night's events. Mass hallucination, temporary disorientation, nothing that couldn't be explained by conventional medicine. But Sarah knew better. She had looked into the spaces between thoughts and saw what lived there. Alien intelligences that fed on consciousness itself, drawn to places where human minds were already vulnerable, already fragmenting. The most terrifying part wasn't that such entities existed. It was how close they had come to succeeding. How easy it would have been to let them strip away everything that made her human, piece by piece, until nothing was left but an empty shell going through the motions of life. She thought about all the people in the world whose memories were already fading, whose connections were already breaking down. Were they safe? Or were there other facilities, other places where the spaces between thoughts grew wide enough for hungry things to slip through? As Sarah drove home that morning, she made herself a promise. She would remember. She would hold on to every messy, inefficient, beautifully human connection she had ever made. Because in the end, that was all that stood between consciousness and the vast and different emptiness that waited in the spaces between thoughts. The radio played softly as she drove, an old song from the 1960s. Without thinking, she began to sing along. "Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream." She stopped abruptly, her blood running cold, because for just a moment she couldn't remember if she had learned that song from her childhood or from something else entirely. In the nearer view, Millbrook Care Facility grew smaller and smaller, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the spaces between her thoughts, something was still listening, still waiting, still learning.